and in fact I am a union delegate.
Hey!
Hey.
Where do you work, Michael?
I work for New Horizons.
Ah, brilliant.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to visit catch up with one of your fun organisers next week. Her name's Rhiannon. She's very good.
She's excellent. That's great, Michael.
As I say to her boss.
And I meticulously take those notes.
So maybe just to have a bit of a chat about my situation where I'm currently working. We've basically got a pool of workers that one lot is receiving block funding. So funding that's essentially received by government, and another pool of workers that's getting employed through the NDIS. Now what we're seeing basically happen is that one lot of workers, that is the block funded mob, is getting paid at a particular grade, and the other lot is getting paid underneath that grade that the former is getting. So what we're experiencing with the introduction of NDIS is a clear race for the bottom in terms of pay rates and entitlement, which I know that the ASU has definitely been recognising and during the canvassing of members. But what I'd like to know is this, that what can workers immediately do to organise around that sort of stuff? Because we're seeing stuff happen now. This isn't stuff that can get worse later on. It's happening now. So I'd just like to know if there's any immediate ideas on what can be done directly on a worker's perspective.
Thanks so much for your comments, Michael, and sharing your experiences. That's not dissimilar to things that we've heard from a lot of workers. I'm really glad that you're meeting with Rhiannon so you can build a strategy on how to deal with it in your workplace. The issue that we've got absolutely is it is a race to the bottom, and we're now in a national scheme. And we're in a national scheme with the same nationalised funding. So unfortunately, to genuinely address that issue in the long term, we're going to have to win and win for everyone. We're going to have to actually lift the entire standard for the whole workforce. We need to have classifications, descriptors of the work that truly reflect the work. I don't know if you've read the classifications in our award. If you need some bedtime reading, that'll put you to sleep. But it does not reflect the work of the sector at all. Some genius who's never set foot in a disability sector workplace or a community sector workplace put those together. So we do need to fight to make sure that the descriptors of our work are correct and that the wages are appropriately pinned to that. What you can do in the immediate sense is members are working in a number of organisations with similar challenges. One in particular, Lifestyle Solutions. The workers there are building a plan for self-managed teams. So they're going, instead of saying the unit price is this much and the person who's employed to deliver it has to therefore be paid a very low rate to meet it, and someone else has got a higher unit price, so the person employed to deliver that can have a higher rate, which is the experience you're dealing with there, is they're saying, well, how do we look at it holistically as an entire service? How do we have teams that are self-managed that allow every worker to take on a greater responsibility and a more fulfilling role, and also therefore a higher rate? And then there are savings that are made to be able to pay for that, because there's not waste, and we're cutting out kind of top administrative burden, and the workers are really investing then in actually the practice of service delivery. So, maybe that's something you guys can explore. I know you've got an enterprise agreement at New Horizons, but we can always be revolutionary. That's what we do in the movement.
Okay. Next, thanks.
Oh, thanks, Natalie. My name's Jim. I think it's really, this is one of the growth industries in Australia, and I suppose I have to say, speaking for myself, it seems to me that some of the issues related here overlap with the question of the massively growing aged care sector, even though they are separate. And I myself have had a friend who ran into a contradiction here, that he became disabled in midlife, and he found himself placed in an aged care situation where a lot of the other people had dementia. Anyway, long story, but it was not it didn't seem to be the right situation there. That's been resolved. But I think, it seems to me the problem that's facing both these sectors, and in general the problem facing our entire healthcare sector, is privatisation and the basically marketisation of an increasing sector of these areas. And it seems to me that some of the contradictions you've mentioned with the current system and the struggle or the rush to the bottom is caused by these large companies, and we're seeing it in aged care sector with Ramsay and these people. And I wonder to what extent even the same companies are getting involved. They're seeing dollar signs about apparently the most rapidly growing sector of the economy and of the workforce is actually going to be in the disability and age, or healthcare disability and aged care. So we're seeing the whole shift in the economy that way. And it would seem that the unions probably need to get together. They're covering different sectors to confront this, and it's going to be a general problem. Okay, thanks. Sort of question.
So can I grab your name again? Sorry, what was his name? Jim, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. You've hit about 7 really important issues in that, so I'll try and really quickly tap on them. First off, growth, absolutely. We know that it's the fastest growing workforce in the economy. 1 in 5 jobs that's created over the next 3 years will be an NDIS job, and we need those to be good jobs. We as a society often talk about the need to invest in maintaining jobs and building jobs. We have invested before in trying to keep the manufacturing industries open and onshore for the purposes of jobs, and that's a good thing. I don't think Adani is a good thing, but people talk about that for jobs. So certainly this is a massive prospect for jobs, and it's one that should be invested into having good jobs. Aged care and disability do have similarities, but they are distinctly different. Disability sector is about goals and achieving goals and supporting people with disability to be able to advance their life skills to be able to reach those goals, which is a difference in focus in the delivery of services in aged care. But they are both caring industries, and they both certainly do need an investment in training to be able to develop areas of specialisation. We are working closely with United Voice. We're also an aged care union. We represent workers in home care, and in particular in home care coordination we work closely with United Voice, who represent the workers who are home care deliverers. United Voice strongly supports our proposal for portable training entitlement and also wants it to be extended to aged care, which we support, so we support that happening. Privatisation. The community sector itself is, I always cringe a little bit when sometimes people who are not from the sector characterise all of the NGO sector as privatisation. Because certainly the not-for-profits and the community-based organisations, the grassroots organisations, they have existed for many, many, many decades. Indeed, they formed services long before any government of any political persuasion thought they should be delivering community services to areas of need in the community. And they have a very fundamental role in our democracy as well as service delivery. But I absolutely agree with your point about the for-profits and the big companies and the boopers and the Uber cares, and there is absolutely no place for that. And I think as a government, this is a strong position of our union and one we're campaigning hard for. Every government of every level has to have a blanket ban on providing government funds to for-profit providers for delivery in community services. It is unfathomable that anyone would think on any day of the week it is okay to turn a profit off the suffering of vulnerable people. Finally, on training and specialisation, there is a very big similarity in aged care, disability sector and community services, which is we do a pretty appalling job as a country in recognising and valuing gendered skills. All of those industries are female dominated. All of them have care and care provision at the core of their work. That is a highly skilled area of work. But it is an area that as a community, we do an appalling job of recognising as skilled. We're very, very good at recognising a boilermaker as skilled work, and it is, but we do a very poor job of recognising somebody who provides support and care and emotional intelligence and strong communication skills, problem solving, dispute resolution as being very valuable skilled work. So I totally take the point that complete devaluing of gendered skills across our workforce is a massive problem.
Okay, come next.
Hey, my name's Maxine and I'm a TAFE teacher. I have two questions. Is that okay? They're very short. My two questions are, as a TAFE teacher about, I don't know, I'm a bit old so years fly, maybe 18, 20 years ago, we decided the government in New South Wales decided in the disability sector that it wasn't good enough for people in group homes to just be well-meaning people off the street, and that all of a sudden everyone in a group home had to have at least a minimum of a Certificate 3 level disability disability work. I remember as a TAFE teacher in the country, we went out and actually skilled people up to that. So my first question is, why did New South Wales, maybe 20 years ago, think that people in workers in group homes should have at least a Certificate 3 level? And of course, if they wanted more pay, they needed a Certificate 4 and a diploma. So why do we think 20 years later that you don't need anything to go into a person's home and provide services to them? That's my first question. My second question is, if you got me thinking tonight when you said people get 3 minutes for every hour they work to do paperwork, etc., etc. So in my head, I imagined like they'd sit in their car and write out their notes, I suppose. But one of the things you didn't talk about was, if they're sitting in their car and writing out their notes, do they then not be at work when they drive to their next job? So are they a bit like Uber Eats or something like that?
Yeah. Thanks, Max. Excellent questions. Okay, so yep, there aren't minimum qualifications now in the sector. It's cheaper that way, unfortunately, and that's the direction of government policy. Certainly they try and argue it's because if you required people to have a minimum level of qualification, that would somehow limit choice for participants. I think, as I said previously, when you build a system, you build it to protect the most vulnerable. And doing away with minimum qualifications for fear of it may limit choice for a very small number of NDIS participants is about exposing the most vulnerable members in the NDIS to a greater level of risk and a lower guaranteed quality of service, especially when, as you say, it's often in people's homes and it's in the community and it's in very personal spaces and very personal interactions, and I think that absolutely warrants a minimum qualification. The issue of travel time is a really good one. We've been really successful in fighting to have travel time recognised as an industrial entitlement, but increasingly we're seeing employers exploit loopholes around that. So, for example, broken shifts is a new beast in our industry. So this is the idea that you can schedule, you can schedule people to say, okay, you're doing 2 hours with this client over here. That's part of your shift. You're then on a break, and you might be on a break for 4 hours or 5 hours, and then you've got your next gig with another client or perhaps the same client a few hours later. And they say that those two things, that equals one shift, but you're not paid for the time in between. You're simply paid for the time that you're delivering services. And that's an absolute abomination, and it completely has to be done away with, but it's something that employers are right now fighting in the Commission to extend.
Okay, somebody else? Please come here.
Hello, good evening everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I'm a support worker in one of the disability services company. I'm privileged to be here today, and I have two questions. Number one is that I want to know, is there any approved hour for a support worker to work with a customer?
And approve.
What I'm trying to say is this, that in a situation where you are working in a company, because it comes to my notice that I think it's one of those things that reduce the quality of care being given to the customer. A situation whereby, is it authentic to work 2 hours with the customers, NDIS approved? Then number 2 question is that I'm working with a particular company, but they keep on telling me to travel to work far away for 2 hours sometimes, for 3 hours sometimes. And when I apply to another company, they still want to employ me as a cashier, and they ask me a particular question that, why did I want to leave the one I'm working with? I told them that because I do travel a lot and it doesn't help me. So they said it will continue that way because NDIS is not helping the situation. In what way? They said NDIS allow customers to change companies as they like. So in view of that, they don't want to have a permanent worker again. They want to make sure that you come, then you do your job. Sometimes they give you your casual loading, but if they don't give you fine, then if they are through with you, or that particular customer you are working with has gone, then you too, you are gone. So there is it, please, I want you to expatiate and then explain those 2 questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Emmanuel. So minimum hours. The minimum hours for an engagement of a worker to come along is for 2 hours. That doesn't mean a client has to request or have 2 hours of provision of service, but you have to be paid for a minimum of 2 hours. Right now, employers are fighting us in the commission. They want to reduce that to 1 hour minimum engagement. And exactly as you said, workers travel great distances to take these shifts to be able to provide services to have a job. So when you pick up the paper and you read the headline that the NDIS is heading for a collision course and a crisis, it absolutely is because of these fundamental problems. The other issue, which is, I'll go to and then there's a bit of a joint answer, around client cancellations is, I mean, absolutely, if I've got a booking at the physiotherapist, which I do from time to time, I've got scoliosis, my back goes. I've got a booking at the physiotherapist, I have a right to call up and cancel my appointment. Usually though, most physiotherapists will have a notice period. And if I'm calling up an hour before I'm meant to be there and saying I'm cancelling my appointment, I'm still going to have to pay for it. Other options are, reimbursement for expenses that could go directly to the service from the government, if not from the client and from the client's packages. This is not a unique industry where a person is able to have the ability to book a service that is paid for by the government. Medicare springs to mind. And any service that we undertake as a person who holds a Medicare card, which is incredibly important to me, sitting right next to me right now. Because I have that Medicare card, I have an entitlement to be able to book services, and when that Medicare card gets swiped, the government pays for it. There is still abilities to regulate to ensure the people who I'm booking my appointment with, that I'm booking my service from, are still remunerated and paid for their work and for their inconvenience if I cancel my bookings. I'm not saying it has to be one or the other, the client should pay if they cancel, or that it should be the government reimburses the services. But somehow we've been able to work out what the solution is in every other industry and service where the government pays for a service and the client gets to exercise deciding when they're going to choose to use it. I don't know why we can't do that in the NDIS. It is lazy policy from a government. So that absolutely has to be addressed, and we're fighting tooth and nail to stop the bosses from being able to reduce the minimum engagement to 1 hour. On the travel time and the travel time and the minimum hours, it is totally conceivable that an employer can arrange work where a client can exercise their right to choose what support they get, by whom and when, and that a worker is still provided a whole package of work. in terms of when they're working and what they're paid for that. The organisations are of such a scale that they absolutely can arrange rosters where you could be working for multiple clients in a shift and be paid properly for that whole shift. Again, it is about shifting risk onto workers by negligent employers. It is a government shifting risk onto employers and saying, not our problem. We don't want to work out that whole thing that we're able to work out for Medicare and every other bloody industry. And then employers saying, well, Jesus, we don't want it to be our problem, so we'll shift it on to the individual workers. So, Emmanuel, very happy to talk to you about coming out to your workplace and working with you and your colleagues to find solutions about how your employer's exploiting those loopholes.
Thanks. Anybody else want to make a comment or ask a question?
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm not necessarily going to be very articulate in my question. My name's Lynn, and it's a related question to Emmanuel's. NDIS support work is being recommended by NGOs that are working with asylum seekers and refugees who have been cut off income support by changes in federal government policy from April till now. So there are very few asylum seekers continuing to receive income support. That group of people is particularly vulnerable to exploitation. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. Lynn, thank you. That was a very articulate and thoughtful question. So last week I had the honour to get to take our delegates to Canberra to lobby for our campaign, and we were joined by delegates from across the country working in the NDIS, and I got to take a number of meetings with Bob, who is one of our members in Queensland, and Bob is an advocate, and he does individual advocacy for people with disability. And Bob works with, in particular, remote communities in far north Queensland, and in particular with Indigenous communities. And one of the communities that he supports has a no-door knock policy. So people aren't allowed to come into the community and, knock on the door and say, sign up to our Wi-Fi system and sign up to our blah, 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 because it is recognised as a particularly vulnerable group who live in this community. And he went to visit one of the people he was supporting, and this woman is an ageing woman with multiple disabilities. She's blind, she's very vulnerable, she doesn't have literacy, and when he went to see her, she told him quite excitedly that she'd just signed up for the NDIS. And he said, "What do you mean you just signed up for the NDIS?" And she said, "Well, they came around to my door and they took down my Medicare number and they took down my pension number, and I've signed all the papers and I've signed up for the NDIS and I'm going to be supported." This was a private company that was peddling their wares to a very vulnerable woman in a very vulnerable community. Now Bob, because he was aware of it, was able to track down this organisation that was doing it. It was a group from North Queensland. The town escapes me. Townsville. There you go. There's a prompt. Townsville. From Townsville, and he has now been in 3 months of dispute with this organisation to hand over what papers she signed and to pursue them. Now, Bob is only able to do that work because he's funded by the Queensland Government as a disability advocate. What has happened with the NDIS is funding for advocates like Bob and his colleagues and his organisations have been totally stripped away. And it is only where good state governments have stepped in to top up funds and provide short-term funding contracts or some kind of level of funding for them to continue to operate. I would imagine that the particular group of asylum seekers that you're talking about would also be in significant need of strong advocacy voices for their interests because of their vulnerability and because they are vulnerable to exploitation. But unfortunately, the government has absolutely stripped away the funding of those advocates, and that's something that we're fighting to get back. So I'd really encourage you to join the campaign, because we're only going to see greater exploitation every single day of vulnerable people as long as advocacy remains unfunded.
Okay, so somebody else? Carl? And then
Charlie Bradley. Got so many questions, but one of my enduring questions just came up, and that is, with these developments, these changes in working life, in some of the most important parts of people's life, there's been a shift to Canberra of the thinking, deciding what structure it might have, and indeed with these private companies. I don't know too much about those, but the shift overseas. Whereas surely the action should be shifted to leave. And indeed the people who work in the area think of it as a local service that they're provided, and where it is localised, best. Would you comment on that?
Thank you.
Thanks, Bradley. That's a great question. Yep, local services are incredibly important. Certainly, local services that are often then governed by not-for-profit voluntary committee of managements that govern those local services mean that there is a deep connection with the community that's being supported, the ability to be agile to the needs of that community and be responsive in quite innovative ways. And one thing that makes my brain explode regularly is when politicians of the Tory persuasion stand up and say, oh, we've got to give it to for-profits because for-profits are so good at innovation. No, we don't need another smartphone app. That's shit. We're talking about human services. The innovation that is fundamental to human services is activism, is grassroots community connection, is being outspoken and advocating. And those are the innovations that we only receive in local community services. There is certainly, I think, recognised specific need, though, in often regional communities or particularly disadvantaged communities where you're always going to have that, I'll use their term, but thin market, where there isn't necessarily a viability for a local organisation to be able to exist. But certainly in those situations, the community sector has done this for a very, very long time, the not-for-profit community sector, and there are partnerships. There are partnerships and there are consortia and there are ability for local community organisations to hold each other up to be able to provide those services. But what we really need is needs-based funding, to take a leaf from my teacher friends' books here. We need needs-based funding, and that some communities are going to have a greater need and therefore need a greater level of funding to be able to deliver appropriate services.
Hi, I'm Rob Long. I work for the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and one of my responsibilities is working for teacher consultants for students with a disability who come to TAFE. And Natalie, I'd really like you to expand a bit more on your idea about encouraging workers to get a specialisation, because what I'm going right through now with my colleagues who are teacher consultants is they're now dumbing them down to not be specialists. So as a teacher in TAFE, if I had a student who was visually impaired, I would go to a specialist who, and often that teacher in TAFE has a visual impairment, and they would give me advice and give me support in how to work specifically with that student as a specialist. Or there'd be someone with cerebral palsy or quadriplegia, and I would have a specialist who would know the needs of that student, who would have no idea about how to deal with a student with visual impairment, but would be an expert in relation to that. And we're losing that right now, and you're talking about trying to build that up. I'd just be interested for you to expand a bit more. How do we make sure that people with a disability get specialist, not generic services, and how do we work together on building those services?
Thanks, Rob. So our proposal is deliberately in 3 stages of training. The induction, of course, is about protecting the worker industrially and their liabilities, but also giving them that basis of what is the NDIS. The second level of having that Certificate 3 is about giving you the breadth of understanding. So it's not specialisation, but certainly breadth is really important as a platform base of understanding and comprehension of the work that's required. The third part is around the specialisation. That's why it's important it's a portable training entitlement that rests with the worker, because they can pursue an area of their interest. And the reason that's so important is because if we agree that people with disability in an NDIS have individual needs and aspirations, then exactly as you say, they don't need the same service. Every single person does not need exactly the same beige service. You know, they need one that's relevant to them and their needs. We think that that's obviously really important for NDIS participants, but certainly we see that as a key to delivering more secure jobs to the workforce. Part of it's about having portable entitlements and finding ways to ensure that those benefits that we've always recognised in secure employment are still able to flow to workers in the NDIS. But a big part of it is when you have a specialisation, you do become a more valuable worker. You become a higher paid worker, a more in demand worker. And instead of sending Emmanuel to, you know, 12 kilometres, sorry, what did you say? You said 12 hours, 2 hours, sorry, 2 hours away to be able to provide a service. You're actually in a position where you can amass together the work that would make a meaningful income and predictability of work in a more approachable area, in a greater location to you. So we think it's good for participants and it's really good for workers in the long term and having those career paths.
Yeah. Okay, we're coming up to 10 past, so anyone else would like to ask a question? Come on, Natalie. You have to come up here, please.
Actually, I actually work in PWGA, so you know, we get lots of work, lots of people coming to us about issues that they're having about getting onto the NDIS. Yeah. So you know, not getting enough support from the NDIS, and being very stressed. Yes. Or people have had services and then the NDIS has come along and they've actually lost the services. Yeah. And I guess I'm just concerned about, you know, how well the NDIS is actually working. And I mean, I'm aware that I think about 90% of people who've got disability are not actually, you know, getting onto the NDIS. The NDIS is only just catering to about 10% of people who've got disability. I guess that, and I am concerned about the privatisation issue, and I think there's lots and lots of issues in there. But I also am concerned about the narrowing down of like the way that we think about disability too. And I think there's actually a regression around the way that we understand possibly, or the way that the NDIS is actually constructing disability. I think that's quite a concern. I think it's becoming quite medical. And that actually concerns me in terms of what you're talking about in terms of specialisation. And I think that we're just losing the big picture. And I am concerned that lots of the complexity of the experience of disability is not being understood or embraced or responded to well. And you know, I'm a person who's actually got, you know, quite a strong human services background, and I've actually, you know, I've experienced that I've not been embraced by the NDIS, and or you know, that they've not wanted me as somebody who has a more broad understanding, I think. Yeah, and in terms of the impacts on my career and my kind of aspirations and hopes for kind of the improvements in my development in my career is a concern in terms of a woman in that sector. But it's just, yeah, lots of issues, and I just think that there's lots to be done about improving disability, and lots of concerns about regressions, impacts on women as workers, and women at home who I think are actually bearing more brunt of responsibility for care. I think you're actually facing quite regressive attitudes, I think, around the greater responsibilities for people who've got needs, disability needs, in fact. Anyway, so there's just lots of concerns, and there's not a question in there, but there's lots and lots of issues, I think, that we need to be thinking about and working around. And anyway, but I'm glad that you're here and that you're bringing these issues up and we're all talking together.
Thanks,
You're right, Natalie. There's a huge load of issues in there, and I've tried to kind of narrow in on a couple tonight, and would welcome the opportunity to speak with you further about there's many issues perhaps at work. The complexity of disability, that's a really excellent point, and I think it's one that's often overlooked in the NDIS, and certainly that's one that we hear repeated often by people who that's the experience that they're having. Speaking to somebody about their needs who actually has no understanding of their particular needs. We believe that's why specialisation is actually important, is so that you absolutely, as I said, you have to have a breadth of knowledge, but also because disability is complex, because there is a complexity of the different needs, to be able to be connected to somebody who is a specialist in that area. I know I used a particular medical example. I used one because it's personally very deep to my heart around women's health, but certainly the areas of specialisation that we've been looking at are not just medical in nature, but certainly around non-verbal communication and around, I hate to use the term managing behaviours, it's just I'm losing words at the moment as the evening progresses, but supporting people to be able to have non-verbal expression and also do so in a way that allows them to, I don't know how to say, I'm trying not to say empowerment, but to be powerful in your own community. And that's an area that members have talked about. It is something that has been certainly watered down since the rollout of the NDIS. That previously, when we had program-based funding, there was a real emphasis on how participants and how people with disability who rely on those services are supported to be able to be in the community and be powerful in the community in expressing their needs and in having those responded to. So I agree with that. I certainly agree that there is a large cohort of people who should be supported by the NDIS who are absolutely missing out. I spoke, by way of example, about psychosocial disability. I know the government's made an announcement about psychosocial disability. I'm very sceptical that what they're announcing is actually going to deliver that. As we know, often needs will be episodic. I was speaking with a worker last week from Victoria who's a community mental health worker who was supporting a person with psychosocial disability who'd finally, after about 3 appeals, been accepted into the NDIS and been given a plan, and the plan was for 10 hours a year of support. So even when you get the golden ticket to be assessed as an NDIS participant, the packages can be absolutely appalling and completely disconnected to what needs are. So that certainly is an issue that needs to be looked at. And I also think that increasingly we are seeing that not all areas of disability and disability support are most appropriately supported by way of the NDIS in that individual package sense. That in addition to that, I'm not arguing for a return to block funding, but in addition to that, we need to preserve program-based funding for a lot of the important programs that support many people with disability in the community.
So please thank Natalie Lang very, very much for her contribution.